I'd like to start today acknowledging the traditional owners on the land on which we meet, our Ngaro and Hia people. Our Ngaro people are, of course, expert mariners, I imagine much like yourselves. So I acknowledge and recognise their connection to land, sea and community, and pay my respects to the elders, the elders, past, present and emerging. Why I'm here today is I want to make sure that your time out there in the Whitsundays, you are engaging and enjoying as much as what we get to every day out there. We're part of a crew of around about 17 staff that care for the marine parks and the island national parks that run from Mackay, pretty much north to Cape Upstart. Now within that, there's about 7 different national park island groups. Probably the one you all hear about is, of course, the Whitsunday Island group. We've also got the Lindemans, the Moles, the Gloucester and Holborn. And each of those islands have different opportunities for you to come and explore, whether it be camping, hiking, short trails, and we are currently building a multi-day walk as well on Whitsunday Island. So what I've got for you today is some photos of our most recent walk upgrades, and most of these have been developed post-tropical cyclone Debbie. We had a very large investment from the Queensland government under 2 different departments to introduce some new recreation opportunities. A lot of our coral was damaged, especially our fringing coral around the islands. So we're looking for new tourism opportunities for people when they're coming to the Whitsundays to actually start heading into the heart of the islands and learning a little bit more along the way. I imagine there'll be lots of questions, and I will try my very best today, at some stage, to answer them. If there's those which I can't do immediately, I do have a little form on the side here that we can just pop your contact details down on. And if I do need to get some more information from one of the other crew, I'm happy to do so and get back to you. First of all, who here has been on one of our national park islands already? Pretty much everybody? Fantastic. I always love to ask where your favourite place is, and for me, it's funny, it's South Pole. It's just there. It's got 12 kilometres of incredible walking tracks and diversity. Unfortunately, the fringing reef has been damaged, but still sitting on the other side or around Plant and Denver, there is still some good hard coral cover. But yeah, it's interesting, just talking to people about what they most enjoy. I know we are often marketed for Hill Inlet and Whitehaven Beach. Spectacular, don't get me wrong. But for me, there's just a connection I have with South Pole, and I imagine everyone's a little bit different as to what they might like about the islands. All right, we'll start off with Langford. It's in the northern section. I'll show you first of all where we did most of the work. So up the north we had Langford Island, a new track and lookout, out at Border Island. We then had put a 3rd lookout at Hill Inlet and improved the tidal access in there. At the moment, if you've been recently, we're upgrading the boardwalk out to Betty's Beach. We're building this multi-day trail. We did an upgrade at Whitehaven Beach and built a new lookout, and also another short walk around Hazelwood Island. So all of that work is in addition to an existing set of trails and campgrounds we have on Lindeman Island and also Mole as well, in South Pole. Short walks are just that. They're under 400 metres long. They're generally a class 3, so really suitable for when you're travelling with families. And they go either to a destination or a viewpoint or an ecological feature. So Langford Island was chosen. It has a lovely vantage point that looks out toward Hayman and back over to Hook, and it has one of the largest bottle trees we have on the islands as well. So endemic to the Whitsundays, the Whitsunday bottle tree. Has anyone done this walk already? No? Yes? It's beautiful at sunset, and we actually during construction put a little sunset seat in there because it's just perfect for it. And we now have an underwater art installation nearby as well. So your visit to Langford Island can give you a little bit of underwater experience and also on the island as well. Our second short walk, we headed over to Border Island. We take inspiration from what you often have forged before us. We've had some informal, I call them yachty trails, up to different vantage points across the islands for some time. One of our key roles as protected area managers is making sure that use is sustainable and managing the impacts that visitors can have. So when we do have those informal trails, often we'll assess it as being something that maybe we can formalise and make sure people are using it correctly, and we'll often choose a route, perhaps reroute, so that we're not creating erosion and runoff from the island around into the coral. And this was just a prime example of that. So Catamaran Bay, beautiful little anchorage inside there. We've got a number of moorings, so it's quite popular. And again, a short walk, it's just around the 430 metre mark. And there's two different vantage points from this particular island. So it's straight up, lovely views back out to the bay, across the ridge line, and another vantage point that's looking out toward Whitehaven Bay. Another walk I can highly recommend. Our third short walk is over at Hazelwood Island. This one's very popular with day guests. So this is an opportunity to again experience under the water and on the islands as well. Just over 300 metres long. It actually heads through about 3 different ecosystems on your way. You've got beautiful eucalypt woodlands, you've got your grass trees, and you've got a bit of beach scrub down the bottom as well. So again, for all of these short walks, it's bang for your buck. You're not going too far, you can take the entire family, and you're going to have a lovely experience. All of them offer beautiful views. From here, you're either looking out toward Whitehaven or straight out to the ocean. So, another one you want to visit. We spent a lot of time rehabilitating Whitehaven Beach. It was probably the most heavily affected area during Cyclone Debbie. Part of that was redeveloping the campground and day use areas, but we also developed a 1.2 kilometre walking trail system that takes you up to the headland, the very southern end of Whitsunday Island. And you've got a view from up there which spans looking directly north, and you can pretty much see the entire island and its peaks. This will actually be the culmination of the larger narrow track which is under construction at the moment. And from this point on your 3rd or 4th day of hiking, you're actually going to be able to look back and see where you've been, which is quite an achievement. I imagine by day 3 you'll be wanting to know that you're at the end. Takes a little bit longer. There's around about 900 steps, I believe, to get up to here. This is a class 4, so it's that little bit harder. Again, my children have done it, just take treats along the way. Probably our most visited site, and in fact it is the most visited site across the entire Great Barrier Reef. The northern end of Whitehaven Beach, or Hill Inlet, with its lookouts, receives more visitors than anywhere else. Managing their impacts, our impacts every day, it takes a lot of effort, a lot of time, and a lot of investment from parks. So that site was hardened. We introduced these precast concrete steps. We widened so we had two-way traffic. There's around 600 to 800 people a day that venture to those lookouts. Now, what I didn't include today was a picture of that view, because you know it. It's the #1 image you've always seen for the Whitsundays. Again, a short walk, 800 metres, and there are 3 viewing platforms where you have unlimited opportunity to see Hill Inlet and Whitehaven Beach. So again, definitely worth your time. Improving the tidal access there has been critical for us as well. It's meant that we can spread the use and load across the site. Nothing worse for you guys to get somewhere and it's crowded. We want to try and alleviate that and give you the best experience possible. So by spreading that across the tidal range a little bit more, we've been able to make it a more enjoyable site to visit as well. So yes, your calf muscles will know you have been there. Part of all of these works has been the introduction of new interpretive signage as well, and for that we've partnered with our traditional owners. So we've had elders from our 4 ethical families actually contribute to all of this signage as well, and more than happy if you wanted to get copies of those, I can send them through. But even happier if you happen to get out there and can enjoy them for yourselves. So that's kind of our short walks, and I'll just shout a little bit. Before I move on from there, this is your guide for seeing the most of the Whitsundays National Parks. Now, the front of the guide takes you through all of our national parks, starting from the Lindeman Group, I believe, heading through the moles, and it identifies for you what walking opportunities there are, and it talks about each site, and this table tells you what you're likely to encounter there, if there's camping, if there's toilets available, those sorts of things. It includes these new walks as well as the existing. So yes, it goes through each section, and at the back of it, we do also have the Conway National Park. So Our counterparts, based out of the Jubilee Pocket Office, manage the Conway and Dryander National Parks. Beautiful walking opportunities again. We've got the Whitsunday Great Walk up the back here through the Conway Ranges. On the island, back 12 years ago, we launched the Whitsunday Narrow Sea Trail. Now that sea trail linked a lot of the then existing short walks that we had, and including the Nara Inlet Rock Art site in Hook Island, or on Hook Island, via sea journeys. They created an ability to kayak between destinations or sail between destinations and take those in. So all of that's included in the book. So please, if you don't have one already, they are also available as a PDF online. I guess what I'd love to share with you today, don't tell anybody. It's a bit of, not really a secret, a bit of a secret though, the Narrow Track. Now, this concept came about again during the same planning phase for those short walks and new opportunities, but it's anything but short. 31 kilometres, 29 kilometres of new track and 2 kilometres of existing. It takes you from Chance Bay over to South Whitehaven. It is incredible. We've had construction crews out there for 12 months and we've got another 12 to 18 months to go. At the moment, we are completing a upper inlet crossing just here, which is a combination of a 160 metre boardwalk through the mangroves and a single span bridge that's about 20 metres long. That should be completed in the next 2 months. We also at the moment have a crew, well actually they mobilise again at the end of next week, on top of the crag. So the Whitsunday Crag is that gigantic big rock face you see. Craig Point, you know, as you're coming, you come through Fitzallen, you're cruising down. That's the Whitsunday Crag. This walk will actually take you to the summit and you feel it the whole way there. It's designed to be a one-way walk, starting from Tongue Bay, venturing and coming out at South Whitehaven. So yes, we've got crews working and actually they're building a ladder system to get up and down the section of rock face, which is down this here. We then will have crews heading out there. We've got some planning to go into for campsite development. This particular project is also held by our Department of Environment and Science Ecotourism Unit, and they're putting out an expression of interest for commercial opportunities to be part of this walk. So, still in a planning, building, construction phase, due to open in another 18 months. Quite an incredible trip though. Yes, and that's the Whitsunday Crag and the top of the inlet. So it does. It's because it's one way from sort of the Torres Herald Bay section. It's about 7 or 6 kilometres, and you're just slowly creeping up. You then walk around the back of it and onto a rock face and down on the very top. So it is going to be. It is going to be quite a remarkable opportunity. Something to rival the Thorns Trail that we have further north. All right, I know we're limited on time, so I'm sorry if I'm rattling on. There's so much to tell you. Look, there's so much out there. I guess get excited. Have a look through this. Talk to your local rangers. Talk to your locals. And know that there's lots of opportunity for you to explore our island national parks. Now, just as a bit of a heads up, we do plan burns every year for a combination of reasons. Management burns, conservation burns. This year we have 2 planned. Coming in the next 2 months. They are totally dependent upon the weather, and they are North Mole and Teague Island. So no book this year. If anyone was here last year, you'd be smiling. The next reminder I have for you in a brochure I would really appreciate you taking time to have a look at is our Bee Pest Free initiative. Another role we're tasked with is looking after the biosecurity of our islands, and that's a responsibility of anybody who visits out there. The spread of introduced plants and animals is critical. Now, at the moment we have a number of invasive ant species in Whitsundays, both on the mainland and venturing out to the islands. So please, anything you're packing in that you're taking with you, check it first. We do have a couple of cane-toad-free islands and we want to keep them that way. We do have others that haven't been so lucky. Ants is a really big one. It seems really minor, but they'll be in here. And invasive ants are not kind to the local ants when they get out there. Other key things is your weed seeds. Now they will, generally you don't have a lot of footwear when we're out there, but they will hide in your boots, they'll hide in your socks. if you've got Velcro in your clothing, take a look at those. And probably the more important thing, what we're experiencing now, is inter-island transfer. So you would have done the right thing. You have cleaned everything before you ventured out there. And at your first stop, say you went to those beautiful lookouts at Hill Inlet, you put your bag on the ground, the African big-headed ant is crawled into it. It's not meant to be there, but it is. You then ventured over to Hook Island to see the rock outside. It's crawled out of the bag. So that inter-island spread is something which we are all responsible for again. So when you hop back on the boat and you're hopping off again, please just take a look before you do so. And the other big reminder, and this is wonderful for those of you who are boating, we have another 25 smaller T&P class moorings being installed next month. So these are for commercial vessels up to 15 metres and private vessels up to 10 I think. At a number of key sites, especially locations. So our Reef Protection program looks at installing moorings where the substrate, whether it be seagrass or coral reef habitat, is likely to be damaged by anchors. So those key areas are listed there. Wonderwall across the back end of Black Island, Blue Pearl Bay, Butterfly, Chalkies Beach, just because it is so popular, and there is a lovely section of remnant coral there. Cockatoo Point, up near Hook, Tongue Bay. So we did introduce that wonderful improved tidal access area, but we found that some of the smaller vessels are still anchored really close to the reef edge because the bigger moorings are being taken up by larger vessels. So we're introducing 4 intermediate between the 2 areas. Langford, Manta Bay, Saba Bay, which again are leading the coral becoming really popular, and Mackerel Bay as well. There's also, in the coming financial year, another larger project called the Reef Trails Queensland, and that will see the introduction of a number of larger class vessel moorings as well. So is everyone familiar with our mooring classes? If not, please take a sticker with you, and also take this wonderful guide, which is a map that shows you in each of our bays the number and size of the moorings that are available. Now, off the top of my head, there's around about 160 moorings in our region that we care for, and there are some that have recently been installed down around the Untitled Islands as well. So again, best way to travel out there, use of a mooring, they're free, they're maintained regularly, we're now installing regularly, and just they get you into the best places as easily as possible. All right, have I used up all of my time? Yes, I've got 2 minutes. Okay, there's my contact, that's always a good start. Before I do go, there is one other brochure that I'd love for you to be aware of, and it's a combination of all of Barrumba's publications, and it's called Visiting Whitsundays. Because we are such a popular spot, we do have a number of regulations that sometimes people are not aware of. So we have the Whitsunday Plan of Management that limits the size of vessels that are moving about. This explains a lot of that in great detail. It explains not just your zoning, but your plan of management implications as well. So that's one to definitely have with you if you're out travelling in the boat. And the next thing, I didn't bring zoning maps today on purpose, because I want everyone to convert to the Island Reef app. And I know Crystal's got lots of information to share with you about how this app is useful for us. It's from a management perspective, we love it. It keeps you in the right place doing the right thing. It gives you a hand to do that without having to come in and crack you over the knuckles. But it also has a really exciting feature, which is on the citizen science level. I know Crystal's got another plate on that. So I'll hold questions till later, is that right? Yeah. Lots of things, resources there to help you when you're around the islands. I hope you've seen something today that's of interest and makes you want to get out there. I'll pass that to Crystal. Thank you for your attention.
All right, can everyone hear me? Yes, perfect. Good morning. My name is Crystal, better known as Little Fish. And I am a Master Reef Guide for the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority, and I've been within the tourism industry for the last 15 odd years, working out on the boats and moving up throughout the marine industry business-wise. But this morning what I'd like to do is talk about our beautiful Great Barrier Reef. So It is a World Heritage listed area from 1981, and it is one of the 7 natural wonders of the world. So the Great Barrier Reef is definitely close to my heart, as I'm sure once you've been out in and amongst it, you will have a little bit of an emotional connection to it as well at some point when you're out there visiting the beautiful reef. Now, before we do begin, I would like to acknowledge our traditional owners of the land and sea country which we're on today, the elders past, present and emerging, and also paying respects to all other traditional owners throughout the Great Barrier Reef World Heritage Area. So let's begin. The Great Barrier Reef. It is special. It is extremely special. As I said, it's a natural wonder of the world. It is one of the largest, if not the largest, ecosystem on the planet, and it's the only living structure that you can see from space. And it's a white line in the blue ocean, as you can see there. And again, yes, it was World Heritage since 1981. So it is extremely special, any part of the Great Barrier Reef. And just to mention that the reef part of the Great Barrier Reef is only about 6% of the entire Great Barrier Reef area. Where are we located right here and now on the Great Barrier Reef? So we do separate the Great Barrier Reef into 3 different sectors. We have the northern sector, the far north sector. The northern sector, we are centralised in the central section of the Great Barrier Reef, right down the very bottom, just before Mackay, and then we have the southern sector of the Great Barrier Reef. So where we are really lucky. We've got the 74 gorgeous islands which you'll be cruising around, which has our fringing reefs around the islands here, and if you can get out to the outer Great Barrier Reef, we've got our beautiful big reefs out there. Obviously the reef is getting closer to us as we're moving down the coast, so you probably are able to get out there on a beautiful day, go to the outer reef, and as you do travel further down south, further up north, you'll be able to get closer, such as sort of Cairns, Cooktown, areas further up north. It's a lot easier to access our outer reef. So the Great Barrier Reef, it is extremely diverse. There is so much stuff out there to see. In terms of animals, plants, there's over 6,000 species of plants and animals that we know of. So that's a really good point to make. There is so much that we don't know about the Great Barrier Reef, so much underwater that hasn't been discovered yet, and there's only the 6,000 species of plants and animals sort of collectively together that we know of to this date. So really, really cool, and there's definitely something different you're going to see every time you get out there in amongst either the water or walking tracks, any part of the reef. But none of these animals, none of these plants, nothing would be possible, especially under the water, if it wasn't for our corals. So our corals are the foundation of life and our master builders of the sea. So that's what we like to call them. If it wasn't for our coral, we wouldn't have pretty much any of our marine life that we have in and around the water. So that's why we call it our foundation of life and our master builders of the sea. So what is coral? Does anyone know what coral is? An animal? Is it just an animal? What else is it? Yeah, so it's a plant and an animal. So our corals are plants and animals. How do we know that we have a healthy reef? Well, a healthy reef is around 80% live coral cover. The rest of it is what we call live coral rock. And live coral rock is, once a coral has died, from any particular reason, but once a coral has died, it leaves behind the limestone skeleton. And on top of that starts to grow algae. And if algae doesn't get mowed down and kept at a sustainable level, the algae will take over and new corals can't grow. So first of all, an indicator species of a healthy reef is lots of herbivores. So our parrotfish, for example, they love to eat our algae. So they'll be mowing around, eating all the algae off the live coral rock, pooing all that beautiful sand that you'll see out around the water. These guys can produce over 1 ton of poo, of sand a year. So a lot of the sand you'll see on the reef, is from our beautiful parrotfish. So what they'll do is they'll mow around and they'll keep our algae at a sustainable level, and that will allow for a special type of algae called that purpley, reddy sort of algae you saw earlier, that precarious coralline algae to grow. Our corals will land on that and they'll start a new coral. So, to be able to do that, we need to have parrotfish, or our grazing herbivores. Our coral trouts, our hump-headed Mary wrasse, and animals like our Barramundi Cod. These are indicator species, and the reason why they're special and important to us is a lot of them have been overfished. So we weren't seeing a lot of them, especially our hump-headed Mary wrasse. They are a protected species, and so is our Barramundi Cod as well. So these guys are really important if you see them on the reef, and pretty much every reef you'll see out here, you'll see one of these guys, if not more. They're important for us to know because we know then that our zoning is working. So all of this will make sense very shortly as we're about to start talking about our app. So all of these guys are really important. Our crown of thorns are an indicator species, so yes, they are native to the Great Barrier Reef. They weren't introduced, they've always been here. They're part of the ecosystem. The reef needs it to keep everything healthy. And the reason why we need them is we want to keep a nice balance on our reef. So, for example, a cyclone is also important to keep balance on the reef. So sometimes particular reefs can have too much hard corals growing because they're the faster growing corals, and they start to dominate a particular area on the reef. Crown of thorns, they'll come along and eat those dominating corals, allowing our other corals to grow to keep that balance in the ecosystem. These guys here, these are our sea cucumbers. They're important. They are an indicator species because what they do is on the seabed, they'll go along and they'll suck up the sand on the seabed. They eat all the extra algae that's on the seabed, pulling out nice clean sand. So they're kind of the vacuum cleaners of the reef, keeping it nice and clean. And a little fishy fun fact for you here is there's a little animal that lives in the bum of a sea cucumber, and he's called the pearlfish. So he likes to live in the bum of the sea cucumber, and he actually eats the intestines of the sea cucumber. So they have two sets of intestines. One they'll use as a defense mechanism. They'll spit it out all over their predators. It's long, it's light, and it's really sticky, and it stinks. And then the other one is the one that they'll actually use. So that spare one that they have there for their predators, these little pearlfish will eat them. And the reason why he lives in the bum is because he's doing a lot of cleaning, and so his bum's doing a lot of pooing. So you may be lucky enough to see that when you're out in and around the reef, but that is an indicator species, our sea cucumbers. And then we've got other animals such as our butterfly fish. These two are probably the most common that you'll see around the Whitsunday Islands when you're out there. And why are our butterfly fish important? Why are they an indicator species? They only like to eat healthy coral. So these guys will eat the coral polyps, those little animals. They've got those nice long noses, little long snouts, and they'll suck them up. So you'll only see parrotfish on a healthy reef with obviously lots of live coral. Why am I talking about all this stuff? Why am I just giving you all this information? Why is really important? And what I find in my own little mind is people can tell me all these things and tell us, oh, this is important and that's important, you should do this and you should do that, but you always wonder why. Why is it so important? Why do you want me to know all this stuff? Why? Well, the reason why is we want to make sure that we can preserve and protect and look after this Great Barrier Reef for many years to come, and the only way we can do that is by researching it, by getting out there and seeing what's currently out there and having an understanding of what's happening in a real time, here and now, state on the Great Barrier Reef. Now, the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority, the guys who govern the entire Great Barrier Reef, they have come up with a citizen science program called the Eye on the Reef program. And ideally, it's targeted to the tourism industry. So there's a few different surveys which our products and our vessels will go out and survey the reef at their different sites, and they'll bring back information of what's happening on their sites. But how else can we access more of the Great Barrier Reef? And it's through you guys. So you're out there in amongst the reef, travelling throughout the entire reef, seeing cool things when you're out there, sometimes not really knowing what it is. How do we get that information back? And it's through this app. So it's a free app, and it's called the Eye on the Reef Sightings App, and it's super easy to use. So when you download the app, which I hope that you do, you'll first of all have this main screen here. So you've got 4 options. You can create a sighting, You've got settings, we've got general information, and this really cool one, which is our marine park zoning. So clicking on that one, it will be able to tell you exactly where you are and what you can and cannot do within that area. So we'll get onto that one a little bit later. But for example, let's say, we're around the beautiful islands, we've just been for a swim, and I just saw a crown of thorn starfish. Now I know I need to tell somebody about that. I'm going to tell Grandpa. So we say we're going to create a sighting. Creating that sighting, and it comes up with this nice, really easy screen here. So it'll tell you the date, the time, your location. If you click into your location, you'll be able to come up with a live map of exactly where you are. And there's a pin that will follow you when you're cruising around the reef, so it'll automatically give you your latitude and longitude. And you can either use that as a sort of a map style, or you can change it to satellite, so you can really see exactly where you are, right down to pinpointing the very point of where you are located. So location is really important. There's a lot of information that we'll find out, especially, for example, the crown thorn starfish, where you'll say, I saw 4 crown thorn starfish on this particular reef. And we'll go, that's cool, but where were you? Because we can send a team out to go and collect them and take them out of the ecosystem until we get to that sustainable level, but I can't do that unless I know exactly where you are. So location is really important. You've got 3 options. Obviously, wildlife, you can report an incident. So an incident could be, we'll talk about that, an incident or a bleaching event. And then you can add extra information if you want to. What your conditions were. Was it raining? Was it sunny? What was your habitat? You can add extra notes like, I saw this cool crown of thorns and he was upside down, he was getting eaten by this other weird looking fish. That's cool information to tell us. And if you've got photos, give us some photos as well so that we can see exactly what you're talking about. You could be uploading a sightings of an animal that you have no idea what it was. You can't find it in the app, but you still want to send us a picture and say, hey, this was really cool. I don't know what it is, but I'm going to send you a picture of it. And then the team will get back to you and let you know exactly what it was and some cool information about it as well. Alrighty, so we're going to say that we're getting a wildlife sighting, and it'll come up with all the different areas. We're going to click on invertebrates. And moving on through, we're going to say, we saw a starfish, and it'll come up with all different types of starfish with images. So it's going to help you out if you don't really know what you're looking at or what it's called. They're saying, there was a crown of thorn starfish, how big it was, how many you saw, and if you click on more information, this is my favourite part, it tells you all the cool stuff about them. And some really cool fun facts as well. So next time you're sitting having a beer, you can pull out your On the Reef Sightings app and do this is my fun fact for the evening, and some cool fun facts on your next afternoon down at the pub. Alrighty, another option, as I said, is creating a sighting. You can create an incident, so that could be you're around the islands and you've seen a dead animal, an injured animal, you've seen some sort of pollution, coral bleaching, damage, and the list goes on. So there's so many things that you can report, and even if you think, I saw that, but I don't know if I can report that, have a little look, because you probably can. It's really important. The more information you know, the more understanding you have about what's currently happening on the reef. The last one is bleaching. So talking about our coral, why do we have a section just for bleaching? As I said earlier, coral's the most important thing. If we don't have coral, we won't have anything else, any of our other marine life. So we want to make sure we're looking after and concentrating and understanding what's happening with our reef when we're out there. So bleaching can get quite difficult, but there is images to all of these, so you have a bit of an understanding. So bleached on at the upper surface of a reef, of a coral. So that's just the very top sections of the coral that's bleached. We've got a pale white or a yellow, so that means he's starting to get a little bit sicker, not as much of that algae living in his tissues. Fluorescing, a bit sicker again. So this image is quite important because the general public will think that the coral's meant to be really vibrant in colour. Bright blues, bright greens, bright purples, like they see, on your documentaries and lots of photos. but most of that is from videography, photo, or photographers using a flashlight, which brings out the vibrance of those colours. Naturally, corals are a sort of a browny, greeny sort of coloured coral. The more vibrant they are, it's actually the sicker they are. So the sicker they are on the reef. And then you'll have the complete white, which is the bleaching coral. One other section to our app, which is the one that Na touched on earlier, which is a really important one, is our marine park zoning. So here you can see, if you click on the marine park zoning, it'll show you all the different zones throughout the reef, and it'll tell you, if you click on the rules, okay, this is where I am, what's the rules in the area that I'm at? Well, currently you're in a yellow zone or a conservation park zone. It'll tell you all the information about it, activities that you can and can't do, and we'll also give you some more extra information about that. So heaps and heaps of information that you can get from our zoning area on that app. Responsible reef practices, which we touched on earlier. There is so many things to think about when you're in and around the water, but as Na touched on earlier as well, is the main thing for us is that we ask that at all times, if you can, use a mooring when you're on the reef. Try not to use an anchor, try to use a mooring wherever you can, so it's minimal impact to anywhere that you are whilst you're out there in and amongst the reef. And these are the ones that you'll see when you're out there, these moorings here. Reduce, reuse, recycle, so we don't want anything thrown over the sides of the boat. We want you to reuse as much as you can and recycling as much as you can. And another one is, please don't feed any of our marine life. They're all wild animals, they don't need to be fed. They're very capable of looking after themselves. They've been doing it forever. We don't need to help them out. So please do not feed any of our marine life. That includes, throwing your scraps overboard, things like that. Keep everything on the boat with you. Now, linking into our tourism industry, recently the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority came up with a activation program which is called the Reef Protection Initiative. So there's been 17 different tourism operators that have been involved in this, and just in the month of March they've been heading out. They've got April as well, but April's not finished yet, so this is the stats for the month of March. They'll be heading out to different areas throughout the entire Great Barrier Reef, collecting data and information about this real-time current state of all different areas throughout the reef. And the main survey they do is a reef health impact survey. But they do crown of thorns starfish collection, drapeller collection, and it's really, really cool to have a current understanding of what's happening, especially out here right now. And what's happening out here around our islands? What are you probably going to see when you're out there around the islands? Well, from Cyclone Debbie in 2017, there was a fair amount of damage, absolutely. And due to that, we've got extra sediment in the water. So this kind of sandy looking stuff. And what that does is it causes low water quality and low water clarity. So it can make it a little bit harder for you to see when you're out there snorkeling. And you'll probably see images like this where you've got sort of sand on patches on the coral around the reef. In saying that though, what they have been seeing currently is pretty much on every site that they've been to throughout the Whitsunday Islands, there's new recruitment. So what new recruitment is new corals growing. So here's some nice close-ups of new corals starting to grow, and all these little ones as well, all throughout the coral, all throughout the bonnies. So new recruitment. So you might not head out there over the next few years and see nice big old species of corals, massive branching corals that look like branches without trees. You may see some nice big boulder corals though, nice big old round ones, look like a big rock. They're the sturdiest corals. They only grow about 1 centimetre a year and they're really tough. But bigger corals, such as our branching corals, for example, they're really brittle and really easy to break. So you probably see a fair bit of coral damage from that. But cruising around the reef, looking slowly, you'll start to see a whole heap of new recruitment, which is really exciting. Which means our reefs are resilient and they're coming back, and there is a lot of those indicator species that we saw earlier, especially our parrotfish, our butterfly fish, and you'll probably see a few of our great ape species as well. One more cool thing about the Reef Sightings App is you can head onto the website, and on the main screen of the website it comes up with all of the recent really cool sightings that people have seen. So if you don't download the app straight away, but you do want to head out around the islands and say, oh, I'd really like to see a manta ray. Has there been any recent manta rays sighted around the islands? Head onto this app and you'll be able to see all the recent sightings and where they are or where they were seen around the islands, to know if that particular animal or that particular coral or whatever it might be that you're chasing was last sighted. And I know that there was a manta ray somewhere near Tongue Bay, sighted just recently actually, which is a bit of an odd spot, but pretty cool. So that's another really cool feature of the Island Reef program, is even if you don't have the app and you have nothing to do with the Island Reef program, you can jump on the website, travel throughout the whole Great Barrier Reef and see where all the current sightings have been and what you might be likely to see when you're out there in a real-time situation. So I'm going to stop because I've really quickly done that talk. There's so much to talk about, but thank you for listening. If you do have questions, if you want to talk about the app or anything else, come and see me afterwards. And enjoy your day. Thank you.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Dr Kate Helmstead. I'm a mathematician and I'm a senior lecturer at the Queensland University of Technology, which is where I do my research and teach kids about maths, which is cool. I'm here through the Flying Scientist program, where we get academics and scientists out of universities and coming into communities and talking to people about science, about how science is really cool and is solving problems that you guys care about. And so I'm really thrilled to be here today to talk to people who really genuinely do care about the Great Barrier Reef, about my research, which is looking at using mathematics and data to try and help protect and save really complex and critical ecosystems like the Great Barrier Reef. So I hope everyone remembers high school calculus. Just kidding, it's not that kind of thing. Okay, so I wrote a paper recently with about 36 scientists from all around Australia looking at ecosystem collapse. And a really key finding that we found is all of these really iconic ecosystems around Australia, like the Great Barrier Reef, things we really care about, like Ningaloo Reef, Shark Bay seagrass beds, no matter where we looked, the Gondwan conifer forests. We found 19 critical ecosystems around Australia that people really care about are either collapsing or on a precipice of collapse, looking like if we keep on going as normal, they will be collapsing soon. And this panicked us, right? Like when you look at this map, they're everywhere. And so this storyline of ecosystem threat and risk is really pervasive right now across Australian ecosystems. It really matters, and trying to fix that problem is really important. And so as we've heard already, I think Crystal set us up really beautifully here to be thinking about the fact that climate change is causing harm and is potentially going to, maybe, lead to collapse of these ecosystems, including the Great Barrier Reef. And we see it in the Great Barrier Reef. It's a place where we really see the evidence clearly. We know what healthy reefs look like, or someone does, and we know what these reefs can look like after these really bad bleaching and cyclone events due to climate change. And so this is a story of degradation. It is. We can't get around that. Right now, these ecosystems are degrading. We are causing harm to them. But I think what's really important is for us to have recognized early that if we know these collapses are potentially going to happen, if we know they're getting close, then we can kind of pull back from it and say it doesn't have to be a story about collapse. Knowing that these things are happening, being able to quantify them and understand them is going to be really important for making sure that we can do something about it now, to try and avoid the collapse. And this is really important for the Great Barrier Reef, right? I think you guys know much more than other Australians, because you guys are here and seeing it and care about it, how much we need from the Great Barrier Reef. And this is true of a lot of ecosystems, right? There's a lot of things that society gets from the environment, and boy would we like to keep on getting it. Some are things that are nice to have, like tourism and fisheries. Some of them are really, really important for the functioning of our society, like coastal protection coming from the reef. or like having to, we have to get food from our environment. That's a really critical thing. We have to be able to either fish or do agriculture. There's some non-negotiables that we need to be able to get from the environment. And what's important is that we can think about how we get what we need, how we can keep enjoying these environments, while kind of ensuring it has a future, thinking about the fact that there are these threats coming in for these systems. You're all wondering when I'm going to start talking about maths, I'm sure. And the fact is that the Great Barrier Reef and a lot of these ecosystems are really, really complex. When I say complex, I mean they're big, huge. In the case of Great Barrier Reef, they are really interconnected. There's a lot of things happening. They're really dynamic, which means they're changing naturally, but they're also changing in response to things that are happening. So we're not just looking, it's not enough to just look at a snapshot of these ecosystems. And so if we're looking at something that is so complex and dynamic and big, the question is how do we understand it, let alone plan for it? So a critical piece of preserving these ecosystems is first of all understanding what's happening. And the good thing is that maths is really good at looking at complex phenomena, and this is what maths has been doing since the advent of maths, right? Looking at things that are a little bit more complex than what we can calculate in our brains, trying to represent those complex phenomena and understand them and predict things using them. And so maths is this perfect tool at the moment that we can come in and try and understand these ecosystems. So one thing that maths is really, really great at is understanding and quantifying relationships between things. So if we think about the most simple relationship in the Great Barrier Reef, in a very complex place with a lot of relationships, the most simple one is maybe one species of fish to another individual from that species. So we can do things with mathematics like understand the breeding rates of these fish, understand how each one of them might compete for resources in the system, so what carrying capacities might be, for example. So using maths, we can build these relationships fairly simply. We can, of course, once we know how to quantify and understand one relationship like that, we can then say, okay, one fish to coral, that's something that's a little bit more complex, but it's a relationship we know how to use maths to describe. And one-to-one relationships, so direct relationships between that fish and different fish, or that fish and things that might eat it, or that fish and things that you don't think they actually compete with each other, but the fact that they're existing in the same space, somehow maybe there's some relationship between them. And so it's really important that we can understand each reef, these one-way relationships, so that we end up with a whole bunch of these one-way relationships, and that turns into models that can understand this really, it's starting to get really spatially complex now, right? And so what we can do is use maths to understand what's going to go on or what's going on in this system. Connections in the Great Barrier Reef don't end with the reef. So the land is connected to the reef by water. So this is called the Great Barrier Reef catchment area. It actually takes up a shockingly large part of Queensland. What the catchment area means is that this is where the rivers and the tributaries and things like that, the streams in this area, they all run onto the reef. So things that are happening here, really, really far away from the reef, impact the water in the reef. That's what we mean by the catchment area. I'm always shocked when I see this and how much of Queensland it is. It's a lot of land that then impacts it. So what happens is, there's the cane farming, that flows into the local rivers, that comes down, and we see that there's a link there into the marine systems via that water. The connections don't stop there with the reef. So there's really strong connections between the reef and people. We know that, you guys know that. You know that boating, diving, this is coastal protection, fishing, there's Indigenous values, traditional owner values that are really important in the Great Barrier Reef. So you guys know they exist, but the really beautiful thing about maths is because maths is really good at understanding those connections. We can do things like quantify these and understand how important they are, and understand when we look at these types of ecosystems, we can say, okay, spatially, these areas are really important for boating. These areas are really important for traditional owners. These areas are really important for coastal protection. And we can start to build this story of this huge, huge spatial ecosystem, and really understand like which parts of that and pieces of that are important to people for different things. So it's a really, really strong connection from these ecosystems to people, to what we call nature's benefits to people. So we can build these environmental models to understand what's happening in the reef. We can build the structure of them. But in order to really understand and get the numbers and the parameters and the details spatially of what those relationships look like, we need a lot of data. And this is really important because maybe how two fish interact with each other is really similar in a patch in the southern Great Barrier Reef to it is in the northern Great Barrier Reef, but the numbers will be different. So it's warmer water, and so there's a slightly stronger breeding rate, or there's slightly less competition for resources maybe. And so having a lot of data about a lot of different species in a lot of different places becomes really challenging when we're trying to understand these systems. And so you've probably heard this phrase big data before. I don't want to burst any bubbles of people who write about and talk about big data a lot. It's a term that doesn't really mean anything. It is what it says on the label. It just means a lot of data. But why we talk about big data a lot is because when we want to collect it or use it or analyze it, it becomes really, really hard. It's a difficult problem for statistics to look at a lot of data. It's computationally expensive to store it. It's hard to pull it all in and analyze it. You have to do different techniques when you have a lot of data. And so it becomes this really interesting challenge for statistics. But what's really cool is that it used to be in the reef, I would say maybe even a decade ago, in many ecosystems it was really hard to get data. Like it's hard. If we're thinking 20 years ago, if you wanted data on the reef, maybe a person would have to go down and dive down and look at it. But now we have, in the past, I would say 5 years, we're starting to get more data than we kind of know what to do with. And this is true across a ton of different ecosystems. And it makes it a thrilling time to be doing mathematics and statistics for environmental problems at the moment. It's better to have a lot of data and our challenge be what do we do with it than it is to sit there and go, well, I guess it's another 18 months before we're going to get any information about this system again. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the really cool new data tools or the new monitoring tools that, or technologies that we're seeing at the moment. And we just heard about one, right? So this idea of citizen science, like you guys contributing to what we know about the Great Barrier Reef, is so brand new, and it's shown to be really valuable across a ton of different ecosystems around the world. There's this movement about citizen science, which is so important because now because we have smartphones and you guys have internet, really easy access to internet, what we can do is we can say there's just so many people who are pretty much scientists that care so much about these ecosystems and have been in them and been interacting with them for so long, they're kind of experts in them. Through citizen science and through things like that app, it's really thrilling to be able to say, like, okay, let's give them this tool, let's give them this ability to pass data on to scientists. So that is one huge source of big data in the environmental systems right now. Another important one is eDNA. So DNA, I think, I was at a grade 5 class yesterday and I said, does anyone know what DNA is? And I got 1,000 different explanations, all of which were perfect. I think most people know what DNA is right now, so you can tell individual people apart, and more importantly, if we can tell us apart with DNA, you can definitely tell that we're people and not fish, right? So if what we're trying to do is monitor and figure out what species are in different areas, just DNA that marks what species they are and how many are there, it's really easy to tell that apart. And now, if you committed a crime today, one of the important changes in DNA technology is they now have touch DNA. So if you touch stuff, they don't just get your fingerprints anymore. You also sometimes leave a tiny trace of DNA behind. And that's enough to get some information. And so using really similar technologies where you only need the tiniest bit of DNA, what scientists have developed is a method where you can get little samples of water, and from that water, you can detect what species have been interacting with that water in that area. You can, in some cases, tell how big populations are in really good circumstances. You can tell that. And this technology is kind of in its infancy, but we're already seeing it being used a lot in environmental systems, particularly in streams and tributaries, where it's a little bit more of a compacted area. They can really detect what species are in those places. And it's really cheap to do. So they can do this eDNA analysis on boats. So you can have this lab out there getting this information kind of live while it's happening. This is really exciting for someone who really wants data on these ecosystems. So another thing that's been really bringing a lot of new data in for my work is drones. So this is my colleague Felipe Gonzalez at QUT, and he's really obsessed with drones. He's a roboticist, and he was looking for, or he has throughout his career been looking for ways to make those drones really useful for helping the world and not just like giving teens a new toy to play with. And so what he's been working on, and I work a bit with him on, is using drones or developing drones that can, for example, go very far. So maybe places that it's really hard to get information about on the Great Barrier Reef. Instead of sending people out there and big boats out there, can we send drones out there to test these things or to take aerial photos? I'm working with him at the moment on trying to think about what we would need to do to drones to be able to have them fly in Antarctica, for example, where there's areas where people can't go. Legally, you can't go in a lot of places in Antarctica. It's really cold, and that's a problem for robots. Who knew? And so, getting these monitoring technologies to be able to deal with these really specific environmental problems, like being able to detect coral cover or fly in Antarctica, is this really cool and like very cutting edge part of monitoring technology at the moment. So as we're talking about looking at things from above, satellite data is also really increasingly important. So I wish I had the number. There's like way more satellites up there than we think there are. And what's happening is we get a lot of photos of the Earth from above really frequently at pretty good resolution, and we can tell a lot from those. So this is my PhD student, Jacinta. She's actually just finished, so I probably should have written Dr. Holloway around here. And she was looking at a problem that is back to this issue of we've got more data than we know what to do with. And if we think about satellite imaging, we get it so frequently that it's like, I don't know, do we just like send these satellite images to Garumpa and say, I don't know, someone should look at them and see how much coral there is? Or is there a way for us to use she's developed complex statistical analyses of these images. So the images we can pull for free from the satellites. Jacinta's methods can analyze things like how much tree cover is there, or in the Great Barrier Reef, how much coral cover might there be, and instead of a person having to do it and that being a big issue in the data processing, we can use statistical analysis that's really like, she just finished her PhD, so this is brand new stuff, to figure out what's happening on Earth. So back to robots. This is my colleague from QUT, Matt Dunbavin. I struggled to find a picture of him where he didn't look miserable holding his he's actually a lovely guy. I guess he just doesn't love these photos. So he's actually stoked about these robots that he invented. So he's another roboticist, and so Felipe is looking at drones that fly in the air, and Matt develops, I guess we could kind of think of them as drones. They're like little unmanned vehicles that can you control them, they're not just floating around by themselves. That might be terrifying, but they're kind of remote controlled data collection vehicles that can go around in the Great Barrier Reef. And so I think he's only got these 2 now, but he's shown that it works, he's shown that it can happen. And so if development is scaled up on something like that, we can imagine that it then becomes really much cheaper and more easy to send these robots out to detect things like the Crown of Thorns outbreaks or the bleaching or other things that are happening in the system. They can bring that information back. We're seeing a lot of an increase in sensors. Environmental sensors are becoming a lot smaller, cheaper and easier to deploy. So sensors, Australian Institute for Marine Science uses a lot of marine sensors to get data. So you probably have seen some versions of this on buoys out in the water. There's also, thinking about that reef catchment area that on land, there's a lot of sensing that can happen in those streams there. So we get, every 15 minutes you can get data from these things and kind of then figure out what to do about them. So using maths, we can model this whole system using this idea of connections and understanding what's going on. The data can bring us a lot of information about really making sure that those models are tailored to the right specific ecosystem in the right places. And so using maths and data allows us to look at the whole system. And when we look at the whole system, first of all, what we can see is a story of degradation. So these are different coral species, year on the x-axis, and some measure of health on the y-axis, and we can see that they are declining. So once we've got these models, we have this data. Yes, okay, we can start really recording and understanding the decline. But a key question for me in my research is not just seeing that the decline is happening, but taking that and saying, okay, what can be done? Like, can mathematics also help with that next step, which is there's only so much money, and there's only so much time, and there's only so much technology. So is there a way that we can optimally, or in the best way, make choices within those restrictions and those constraints to really best service or best protect the entirety of this massive ecosystem? And so to be able to think about what we can do, we have to think about the threats. And Crystal touched on these beautifully. So water quality is a big threat to the Great Barrier Reef. Crown of Thorns starfish. I got a prettier photo of the Crown of Thorns starfish, so it's harder to sell them as a villain, but that starfish is eating that coral. And of course, climate change. I just really want to be very, very clear here. When I'm talking about managing the Great Barrier Reef and making these choices about where to do things and how to protect it, it is all under the lens of, if climate change continues, all of this means nothing. Okay, so if climate change continues how it's going, we're rearranging chairs on the deck chairs on the Titanic here. Okay, but what we can do is say, okay, let's have faith. Let's have faith in society and in governments that climate change will be getting better over time. Then a critical question for the Great Barrier Reef becomes, how do we make sure that we're buying time and managing the system today in the best way that we possibly can, and laying extra threats on top of climate change so that we can buy that time until we've got climate change under control. So my work is not about how to get climate change under control. That's a bigger problem for other people. I'm trying to think about how do we not add to that and how do we buy time. Okay, so my research is focused on how this maths and this data can and is helping to save the reef. So this is about half of my research team, the QUT Applied Mathematical Ecology group that I lead at QUT. So it's not just me doing these problems and trying to put maths to the Great Barrier Reef, it's at least this team that I've been building at QUT and many more scientists, both mathematicians and non-mathematicians in universities, in Gabroonpa, in Queensland Parks Wildlife. There's a ton of scientists doing this, but I'm going to tell you a bit about what I've been doing with my group. So the first thing, of course, is in understanding this ecosystem collapse. So not just understanding that it is happening, but understanding what actually does it mean, what does that collapse look like? So this is Dana. She's actually, ironically, a scientist at the Australian Antarctic Division. But because we were looking at collapse in Antarctic systems, we spread that out and started looking at collapse across many ecosystems in Australia. And what we were showing here, so this is a specific reef in the Great Barrier Reef. So the red line is hard coral, so you can think of the red line as being what we want. And the green line is algae. And although algae, it is good and it's fine, too much of it becomes really bad. And what can happen when an individual reef collapses is it flicks over from being mostly coral to being mostly algae. And so what we were showing here is that change is really rapid. So when that shift is happening, it can be recovered. So it's not always just going to stay like that forever, but it can be this really rapid flip and sudden loss. So having this idea that this might be happening in these systems and the collapse might be coming up helps us look for and monitor for things that might be that sudden flip. So that was really cool work that came out of a collaboration with Dana. Another way in which maths and data has been really useful for the Great Barrier Reef is in defining these marine protected areas. So the places that these marine protected areas ended up being is based, at least on part, in how we understand the system based on mathematics. And this is true in the marine parks in the Great Barrier Reef. It's true in other marine parks across Australia as well. So if we think about marine parks in Tasmania, in Western Australia, but also the same maths and science holds for placing national parks on the land as well. So where we put protected areas, it all comes back to really similar questions of things like, do we care most about the number of species protected, or most about coral cover? Do we care mostly about economic values or about connectivity? Is that really important? So we can use maths to kind of capture these ideas and feed those into where those protected areas should be. Like, Garumpa didn't just say like, protected area there, I'm going to be really annoying and put conservation there. It was all based on this like maths and science. So another thing that two of my current PhD students, Megan and Ryu, are working on at the moment is thinking about planning the restoration of reefs that are already a little bit degraded. And so if we think about that question of where should we put protected areas, that's saying let's look spatially and say where should we do this one activity, put a protected area. What Megan and Ryu are looking at is saying, okay, but right now there's more options than just placing protected areas. There's also other things that we might be able to do. And in the future there might be even more things we might be able to do. And thinking about using those same spatial questions to say, where should we do those things to have the biggest impact in this highly connected, complex system? So I'm currently a fellow through the Australian Research Council, and my fellowship is based on the idea of planning new technologies for helping ecosystems like the Great Barrier Reef. So if we can't protect the Great Barrier Reef or other ecosystems with the technologies we have right now, what's going to happen is engineers and chemists and geneticists are going to develop new technological ways for us to help the reef and other systems. So for example, my colleague Dan Harrison is developing what's called cloud brightening, which is you shoot kind of smallish particles into the air, and the question is can that then create like a little artificial cloud that can protect ecosystems from the sun on those really critically hot days? But this is a new technology. It's not fully developed. It's not deployable right now necessarily, and there's other technologies much like that, or nothing like that, but there's other technologies that are just as hard for me to understand and describe, like different ways that they can build stability into these reefs that are kind of rubbleized at the moment. And so my question is it costs a lot to develop technologies. Is there a way that we can choose which ones we might want to develop so that then in the future, when Megan and Ryu are thinking about where to do things, that they have the best possible technological options available to them. So thinking about that land to reef connection, agriculture through to the rivers and tributaries, through to the water in the Great Barrier Reef. My colleague, Dr. Helen Mayfield, has built this awesome model that looks at the different types of policies that the Queensland government might be able to do to get landholders, so those cane farmers, to reduce the amount of runoff that they're producing. So there's a ton of options of what you might do. So the government might have extension officers who go and educate and work with those landholders. There might be regulations and penalties and breaking regulations, and there's often financial grants and payments for doing things on your land, financial payments. And she's built this model of like, how do landholders, if they're getting all those options, what happens in their head? How do they decide whether they're going to then take up more environmentally friendly or reef-friendly farming practices? And so she's built this amazing model to try and predict that, so that then we can say, well, now we know how to predict the impact of these things. This is where and when and which ones of these you should choose. We're not at that point yet, but we've got the model. So my student Kanu Agarwal is looking at this crown of thorns starfish issue. So crown of thorns is a huge issue, and when they are in outbreak, managing them becomes really difficult and very expensive. There's so many of them, we can't necessarily go and like catch them all or kill them all and to deal with that outbreak. And so the question becomes, when there is an outbreak of something like the crown of thorns across such a massive landscape, or seascape I suppose, where should we be thinking about managing them? Like, what is the most important place for us to put those resources to go and catch them and kill them? And so what she can do is build a model that says, you know, this is what the system looks like when there's an outbreak if we're not controlling the crown of thorns. It looks different if we are doing control in that area. And if we can build that model and look at that for one single place, for one single type of control, we can build that model and understand that for a lot of different places and say, okay, this looks better in these places, so that's where we should do the control. Or if we bump up how much control we do, then we get a much better outcome. So she's building these models to be able to ask those questions about planning that control. And so this is just a little taste, I guess, of how maths and data is really helping to build a more sustainable Great Barrier Reef and make sure it's around for all the stuff we want to do. Thank you. So I'd say what we're probably going to do is all come up and answer questions for all of us at the same time.
Yes.
Yeah.
That is so exciting.
Thanks.
It took me back to 5 minutes.
Oh, good.
That was
Yeah.
a long time ago. That was really good.
Do we have to yell?
Question time.
Question time. Hardest questions to the end.
Yeah.
That's the scientist there.
Yeah.
I've got a question. Once a reef has been bleached, can it resuscitate or redevelop?
You can start. Okay.
Pass the buck.
Yes it can. So it's a really interesting process. So the whole sort of life cycle of a coral. First of all, we did mention about a healthy reef is sort of around 80% live coral cover. The rest of it's what we call this live coral rock, right? So live coral rock is dead coral, effectively, with algae starting to grow on top of it. You have your herbivorous fish mowing it down, keeping it to a sustainable level, because if it grows too high, I suppose, or becomes too much on a reef, we get that flip of an algal sort of graveyard, I suppose you could say, for a reef. So we need those herbivorous fish to keep it at a sustainable level, nice and short and mowed beautifully, for our next generation of corals to be able to find their way to the rocks, the limestone skeleton of the dead coral before it, to be able to find a nice little spot for it to land on and turn into the coral polyp and start to grow. So if a particular coral or a reef gets decimated by whether it's a cyclone or crown of thorns or whatever that may be, as long as there is other animals within that area, so for example you grazing herbivores like your parrotfish, as long as there's other animals there to make sure that the algae doesn't get to an unsustainable level, you'll be able to have corals or your little little worm, your little baby corals coming in through the water column to be able to land on that live coral rock to start a new reef. In addition to that, obviously you don't want to have the water temperature too warm, because if the water temperature is too warm, then that could have been the reason why the coral died in the first place, through the coral bleaching, where that zooxanthellae, the algae that lives within the coral's tissues, left, causing it to bleach, causing it to die in the first place. Is that a good basic answer to that? Yeah, we're good with that. Excellent,
So,
thank you.
adding to that, does this mean that if they get a little foothold on the recovery, then that would spread, because you've got to get the lawnmowers there.
Exactly.
So you need them to start somewhere and get into a corner reef and start working on it.
Absolutely. Do you want? Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's where that idea of connectivity becomes really important. So if we're thinking about where to do restoration, where to get that little foothold in,
Yeah.
choosing somewhere that will spread and spread and spread is really important.
That was sort of what I was going to say, is there things being done by people to encourage that process to be happening now on the Great Barrier Reef?
It's like we all know answers.
Yeah, actually, we're in the very early stages at the moment of developing a bit of a reef restoration project through Queensland Parks Wildlife, and hopefully getting some local operators involved as well out of Great Reef, which is quite exciting. Still in the early stages, so still planning it out, working out the best site, picking the site, working out how it's going to develop and where we're going to do it, what sort of processes we're going to use to make it happen. They've done some trials and they've done a site up at Green Island as well, where they've been working on it. So yeah, so watch this space for that one. So that's something that's in the pipeline.
With your coral gardening, so I went with a group from Newcastle University and went to Vanuatu, and they an island just off there, and they had Rio,
Yeah.
right, anchored down to the thing, and then they got zip ties
Yeah.
and got pieces and
Little
zip ties
clippings
on.
and
Yeah.
yeah.
So is that what you're doing?
It's a similar process. Yeah. Yeah.
There's a few different processes,
Yeah.
so that is definitely one of them. Yeah, so like collecting a fragment of coral and putting it to like a pyramid or a tray and zip tying it to the tray and having it suspended in the water column is one, or on the seabed. What we used at Hardy Reef was kind of like a putty. Was like a two-piece putty that you mixed together. It was like an underwater cement, basically, where you got your fragments or your pieces of coral, and you took it to the spot, mixed your little bit of cement underneath the water, and like really gently like made a little nice little home for it, effectively creating like a limestone skeleton base or a cement base, and then putting it in there, and then that's how it grew. So there's a few different ways, and then. What else is there actually? They're probably the two most common ones, I would say.
A glue or a fixing.
Yeah. And making it so whatever you're clipping it to is going to be the structure for the reef, pretty much. So having it, so there's other ones where they're sort of shapes a bit like this, creates hidey holes for fish underneath. So as the coral grows on top and around, you're creating that reef structure that would be a naturally formed rock in normal cases, but it's creating this structure that hopefully in years to come you won't even see that Rio type bar.
Yeah, because it's sort of absorbed, like you put all this
Yeah.
It's creating artificial
stuff in the water.
It is,
yeah.
into the ocean to build the reef.
Yeah.
But
And there's been work done using, I know some people use the cable ties, using biodegradable cable ties that over time will disintegrate and disappear within the marine environment, but leave that coral still, they stay on it long enough for that coral to grow onto the structure, and then that cable tie will disappear, but...
Taking it off manually.
Yeah, exactly,
Yeah.
would be the other option.
see, I'm from down south, and the first time I've been to Heron Island 4 times in my life, and I went there when I was 10. And the coral all looked like this behind you. Absolutely beautiful, wonderful garden with colour and everything like that. And then I went back again, probably about 20 years later, and took my children, and I noticed the difference, but it was still good. And then I went back probably another 10, 15 years later, and I was just devastated.
Yeah,
And
that's a
then
really
another,
good point to make.
And then another probably 3 years after that, 2, 3, just, I'm crying in the goggles.
Yeah.
That's a really good point to make, actually, and it's interesting because when, that's pretty tough stuff to be talking about, and it can be quite confronting when you get questions like that, because you sort of, you're talking about the reef as a general and, it's resilient and we're looking after it and this is what we want to do, protect it. But then, we get well, hang on a second, like I've been out here and it looked really cool back then and these are the pictures you're showing, but it looks pretty crap now.
Mm-hmm.
So how can you front that?
Well, we
and
did
I
ask
really
questions and they said,
Yeah.
oh, no, it's not dead, it's not dead.
Yeah, and I really like those questions and the reason for that is a lot of the time most people that access the Great Barrier Reef are going on, tourism vessels, right? So they're going to tourism sites. So what the general public mainly see is impacted areas of the Great Barrier Reef. They don't get to get out to these places, the pristine places where people have never been before, and have never seen, a spot where that particular reef's, you might be the very first person, the only person to ever actually snorkel on that patch, which is pretty cool. You might be the only person to ever have that interaction with that particular animal ever. They may have never seen a human before, they may have never seen another human again. Whereas what we're getting at here is it's really hard for us and for others in the tourism industry to talk about reef resilience and the process of the life of a coral, and yes, it's good in areas and then it gets affected and then it dies and then it grows back. We got to remember, the Great Barrier Reef is hundreds of thousands of years old. It's been through this kind of stuff before naturally. Naturally, reefs will be beautiful and thrive, and then they'll go through some kind of an impact, mainly natural impacts by whether it may be crown of thorns, propeller or something like that. Obviously us humans are just putting extra threats on top of that, making it really hard for our corals to survive, and that's why we've got scientists and everyone else doing all of these things to help combat that, because we're making it so much worse so much quicker. But it is important to note that a lot of the time people are going out to the reef and they're only seeing these impacted sites. They're not getting to see the rest of the Great Barrier Reef. The rest of the Great Barrier Reef isn't perfect, we know that, but there is sites where it is gorgeous, and there is sites where there is heaps of impact, like the crown of thorns starfish, for example. Most of those outbreaks aren't actually on tourism sites. Most of them are on reefs where only scientists and marine parks and Grumper have been able to go and visit, and that's how we've kind of learnt that information of, we've got really big problem of crown of thorns, and it's not even at places that our tourists are going. So I guess it's a bit of an all-round, there is issues with the reefs, but remembering that most people don't get to see a beautiful reef anyway, because we don't get to showcase that, because we, it's like a zoo, you have a few animals in the zoo to try to educate people and get them to understand, you know, how important they are in the wild, so that we can
It's
save
like
the
a
rest.
sacrifice. You're
Yeah.
sacrificing part of it so that you can still let people know about it and educate people, but try and protect the other bits too. Too many people
That's right. Yeah.
spoil it.
Sorry.
You're right, mate. Is there potential for the app to create overcrowding on more popular sites and even more popular animals, even lead to people actually chasing animals such as pretty whales as opposed to the dugong?
I don't think so. I don't think. Let me process that question for a minute. So we're asking if the app could potentially highlight areas where it's really cool, and then you think, and we're talking about possibly having too many people go to those
Yeah, just
particular
because
areas.
the
Is that right?
information and the location is far more easily accessible rather than word of mouth or local knowledge, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's definitely a potential for that, I suppose, in some cases. However, the app is for the entire Great Barrier Reef, so and it's for, you know, not just tourism industry where they go to particular sites where they're seeing, you know, cool things each and every day, where they're already high impacted areas anyway. The app is also for the entire Great Barrier Reef for areas where we can't access, which, you know, people like yourselves who, or some of you may have your own vessels, can go to these unique places. And if you're spotting at a reef right at the very end of the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park, and you think, oh my gosh, I just saw 300 manta rays there, and they were like jumping out of the water, and it was epic. We're not going to get an influx of people heading out there because it's just not possible. So I suppose there's a bit of a yes answer to that, and probably a no at the same time, if that helps.
You probably want to weigh up the benefit of
Yeah.
it too. So I imagine the benefit of that data collection is far going to outweigh the possible detriment of someone chasing. And let me just say, I myself have gone, right, I'm determined to go and see a pod of pilot whales in the Whitsundays. I have not found them. And I know all the places they go, but they're not there on the day that I tried. And eventually I gave up. And then spontaneously, let me just say, between Shore and Lindemann, it's brilliant.
And that's a good point too, because you might spot something one day and then it may never be there again.
14 years, I
yeah.
tried.
Yeah.
Given the diversity of views that we all get from mainstream and other medias, and from one end of the scale to the other, how is the health of the reef today compared with 10 years ago?
We all talk to that. Do you want to talk?
No.
No?
If you give me the data, I can tell you. You guys know that data. Yeah.
Well, I mean, look, it's nowhere near as perfect as what it was 30, 40, 50, 60, 100 years ago. There is impacts, there is many impacts, and unfortunately just us being on the planet is no good to the Great Barrier Reef, or therefore any reefs throughout the world. Again, touching on what most people get to see and most people get to experience is those impacted sites. So yeah, every single year they're going to probably get worse. However, the tourism industry are, really on the front foot in conservation protection, but number one is education and understanding. That is more important than anything else for the tourism industry, to make sure that if you do go to a reef and you do have a bit of a chance to see it, why is it important? What's so special about it? How can you look after it? What can you do when you go home to help not just the Great Barrier Reef, but reefs throughout the world? In general, yeah, they are struggling, absolutely. Climate change is massive. It's going to keep, the water's going to keep getting warmer. We're still going to have, corals struggling every single year throughout summer. We are going to have some massive cyclones that, wreck reefs, but at the same time do good for keeping the water at that, optimal temperature. So, I mean, look, overall, I suppose if you look at the data, the reef's in a decline, absolutely, but that doesn't mean that that's the end of the story. You know what I mean? It really comes down to that education and understanding and what you can do, even if you don't live anywhere near the ocean. How can you help, minimise the impacts that we have on the reef?
It's that resilience. You catch a cold, you'll get over it.
Yeah.
By this time next year, you're fine. You catch a cold, then you get sunburnt, then you can't breathe because the air's polluted. It's going to take you longer to recover. So that's what's happening to our reef. every event is becoming a longer recovery period because there are too many threats. So by reducing those number of threats or the extent to which they're impacting on the reef, we can see quicker recovery. Impacts are always going to exist. They exist naturally and they can be induced by our input as well. But it's just that analogy, it makes so much sense to me. You know, I can cope with one thing, but you give me 6 of them in a row, or if I get bouts of it repeatedly or different things hitting me from every direction, it's really hard to come back. And that's what has occurred in the last few decades.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think that's a really good point to bring this formally to an end, but that by no means means this is over. Please, those that do have questions, I know there's a few of you raising your hands here. I'm certain that they would love to answer your questions. Please do come up, let's mingle, let's chat more about it. But I would just like, if you could all join me before anyone sort of rushes off, I would just love to say thank you to all of our speakers for